changing the world, the possibilities of geoengineering. And I'll be moderating, so I will start by letting the other people introduce themselves, and we can start with the man who needs no introduction since he's our guest of honor.
Okay, so on we go. Kim Stanley Robinson, science fiction writer, and pleased to be here.
Yes, my name is Tom Wigley, and I'm an academic, but I've retired, and I write science, but there are some people who probably think I write science fiction, like Tony Abbott, and even more famous stories from people in the United States. Already an Abbott joke. Abbott and Costello next. I've actually published about 5 or 6 papers in geoengineering, mostly carbon sequestration, though I have done in the last few years, particularly at the behest of DARPA, some studies about using aerosols to cool, particularly the Arctic.
And I'm Sam Shiner. I'm a scientist at ecology and evolutionary biology. I work at the U.S. National Science Foundation, and I can say for everybody at NSF, it's great to have a novel in which NSF program officers are the heroes. So we're going to talk about geoengineering, and obviously in the context of climate change, and this is always an interesting one, question to ask an audience to start out, especially because this will probably be different from U.S. audiences. So how many here agree with the statement that the global climate is changing at a rate much faster than in recent human history? Raise your hand. Okay. And how many people agree then with the statement that humans are one of the primary drivers of that change? Okay. So when we did this at a WorldCon a couple of years ago in the U.S., and about half the audience were climate skeptics. So things are changing, and what are we going to do about it? So this is about geoengineering, and I'll let the others speak, but I'll note that I'll probably be the note of caution as the ecologist of what are all the things that are likely to screw up even worse than simply letting things happen. So, who wants to start with?
We should start with Tom.
Tom, yeah. I've actually did it.
Surprise. The reason why we're thinking about geoengineering in a serious way is simply because of the potential magnitude of future climate change. And there are some aspects of that not everybody is going to be familiar with. So what we thought we would do is just start with a little introduction to the background to geoengineering, the climate change aspect and the difficulty of, this is a debatable point, but the possible difficulty of using conventional methods to solve the climate problem. Geoengineering can be viewed as a rather unconventional method. So I'm just going to go through about 10 slides, giving you some background to issues related to climate change, and then we can move on from there in a more general sort of discussion. I think this should... Okay, so I'm just starting here with a picture of global temperature changes over the last 100 years or so, and the little boxes at the bottom are what we think are the explanations for the trends, the early 20th century trends, the levelling off of temperature changes subsequent to that and the more recent warming. And I won't give you time to read about that, but the crucial thing is that there's no doubt that global temperatures have risen substantially over the last 100 years, and we do have a pretty good understanding as to why that is, but that doesn't mean to say that there aren't a number of uncertainties. This next picture puts that in a longer timescale context. The first half of that diagram shows the diagram that I showed before, the observed change in temperature, and then there are 3 projected changes in temperature over the next 100 years from a very low probability bottom projection there, an intermediate kind of best guess projection, and then a high projection. The low and the high are like the 1 percentile probabilities. So if you look at the low projection, it is possible that by doing nothing, if everything was right and in our favour, then we might not need to do anything in order to solve the climate problem. But the probability of that is really, really small. Okay, so what are possible global policies for reducing the magnitude of future climate change based on? There are two key things. One is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Article 2 says that basically we should stabilise the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in order to avoid dangerous interference with the climate system. Dangerous interference is not defined, but then more recently people tried to define that, and the Copenhagen Accord essentially says that dangerous interference, that threshold, is if the warming exceeded 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. And so far, we've warmed the world by about 0.8 of a degree, so there's only 1.2 to go. And then we get into the probability that dangerous interference might be significant, even without defining exactly what that is. Okay, so in order to stabilise the temperature, what do we need to do? Well, the traditional mechanism is to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, and this next picture shows the magnitude of reduction required. The red curve is a projection, a sort of central projection of if we do nothing, this is what's going to happen to the emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion. And the blue curve is one of many possible projections that stabilises the climate at about 2 degrees warmer relative to pre-industrial times, but with a 50% probability that we might fare above or below that 2 degrees. So this is not certainly getting to the 2 degree threshold, it's giving us a 50-50 chance of reaching that particular threshold. Okay, so that's very interesting. You can see on the left-hand side that this projection was done a few years ago, and we're already beyond the pathway that was required to get to the 450 stabilisation level. So that just makes it a little bit harder. It would mean the reductions in emissions should have to be greater in the future than projected in that particular diagram. Now, one of the things that is not considered in the Copenhagen Accord is sea level rise, and that is an important aspect of climate change, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on for the next few pictures. Okay, so this diagram shows what would happen as a best guess to sea level rise if you follow those two emissions pathways. One is the business as usual, no climate policy pathway, only goes out to 2095 in this particular case, and a lot of question marks after that, but it's heading up rapidly. And the other curve basically shows that even if we stabilise temperature, we don't stabilise sea level. And that's a really important thing. The inertia of the oceans is such that stabilising sea level is a much more difficult problem than stabilising temperature. So the next diagram shows what would happen if we chose different stabilisation levels for CO2 in the atmosphere. What would happen to sea level? And these levels are 550 parts per million, which is about double the pre-industrial level, 450, which is the one I showed before, 350 and 250. And what's amazing is that there's a book by one of my co-panelists here who somehow, I don't know how he did this, but he got the same answer that I get by a rather detailed scientific calculation. Okay, so how do we actually follow those pathways? What emissions reductions would be required to follow those pathways? And the thing to recognise here is that to stabilise sea level, we might have to go back to some level of CO2 less than the pre-industrial level, which was about 280 parts per million. And the emissions reductions required to do that are rather large. Basically, it's that bottom curve there that would require us sucking a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for a long period of time in order to get back to this pre-industrial level of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And I put that again in the context of an earlier diagram showing the business as usual case, that red curve. That's what happens if we do nothing to emissions of carbon dioxide. The blue stabilises temperature, and the bottom of the yellow curve is what's required to stabilise sea level. And you can see those arrows just give you some idea of the relative reduction in emissions required to follow those pathways. There's a lot of uncertainties here. I'm not showing any of the uncertainties. It's kind of best guess answers. And the next diagram says a little bit more about the temperature stabilization case, right? So this is something that I think we've got to go well beyond. And I put on the right-hand side some statements from some energy economists. You know, these people are very well known in their field, and Jeffrey Sachs is probably one of the preeminent environmental economists in the world. And both of them essentially say, even to stabilise at 450 parts per million, that's a really difficult job. So clearly to stabilise at a lower level, stabilise sea level, is much, much more difficult. And just to conclude, these are my personal views, but they're shared by many people. I'm sorry if I haven't been speaking to the microphone very well, but okay, so if we can't get to 450 parts per million, we certainly can't get to 250 parts per million. It might be that we can go above 450 and then come back down again. So that's what's called an overshoot scenario. People have explored those possibilities. But you know, it may be, if you believe these economists, that it's going to be very difficult to get to 450 parts per million. What if, as I've implied, the target should be much less than 450, then it becomes even harder. So that means that we might have to consider unconventional methods, not just standard removing coal from the energy cycle and going to renewables or going to nuclear or something, but something beyond reducing our dependence on fossil fuels as the primary energy source. So I'll just stop at that point, and that's just meant to, you know, essentially my view, my personal view, and this is why I think we have to consider geoengineering, which is today's topic, very, very seriously. Okay, thanks.
So, Greg, you want to give us a few examples of what we might do?
Right. I gave a talk on this an hour long yesterday, and if you saw it, I basically broke it into, first is carbon sequestration, which of course is going to be needed, and needed right now, to pull as much as you can out of the atmosphere. But I'm not optimistic about that. The artificial methods are extremely expensive, and in fact, the report on that is about to appear. So I, after earlier work in carbon sequestration, moved to what I regard as the most dangerous possibility that's easily approachable, particularly by the United States, and that is the warming of the Arctic. Of course, most of the talk about using aerosols in the stratosphere has focused on doing the whole planet. I actually think since the Arctic is the most threatened region and has suffered the most warming, that we should do a smaller scale experiment and do it where only a small number of nations actually have land in the Arctic, I think 7 or 8. And so I've looked at that in some detail, particularly for DARPA. We can do this. It's really cheap. It's $1 or $2 billion a year. And the idea is you put aerosols, probably a sulfur aerosol, up at an altitude of around 45,000 feet. Yeah, you do so in late May, and it will have come down through into the troposphere, which we're breathing here, out of the stratosphere into the troposphere, and the rain or snow out. It will be less than 1% of the sulfur that's actually in the Arctic air already, because the Russians burn a lot of sulfur in their mining. So it's not, in that sense, a big acid rain contributor. But what you can do is put up in the range, we're talking here about megatons, several megatons of sulfur, to make SO2 and H2SO4. We can do that, and we can cool the Arctic and arrest the loss of the sea ice that is progressively getting worse. Some people, 10 years ago, considered how long would it take before the sea ice melted in the summer in the Arctic, and the answer was 2080 or 2100. But a lot of people believe that could occur now within a couple of decades, maybe even less, because it's accelerating and because it's a positive feedback. The more ice you lose, the more the Arctic Ocean gets warmed by sunlight because it's dark, and the more heating you get. The other big trigger, the real possibility of a mega disaster that would destroy civilization, is if you start to get amplified methane emission from the tundra in the Arctic. And those effects have been detected in the last 10 years. They're not large yet, but they're clearly accelerating. I mean, talk yesterday, I showed a picture of people around a hole cut in some lake ice last year, and somebody lit the gas that was bubbling up from the lake. This is in early spring, and there are these flames dancing above the lake from the methane. That's been my primary interest. The one nation in the world that can do the Arctic right now is the United States. Possibly the Russians could, and the reason is that we have refueling aircraft, the KC Extender, which is almost ideal for spreading things in the stratosphere. But the other good thing about the Arctic is that the stratosphere begins at around 38,000 feet, and so we can get airplanes that will be well up in the stratosphere, and we can do this now. It is much tougher to operate in the stratosphere of the tropics, which is about 50,000 feet. And so I try to pick the sweet spot where you can do something if you need, because I personally believe that we're going to continue to dither over this issue, and in 1 to 2 decades, we're going to get some really bad effects, and there's going to be a panic. And then we will be trying to do geoengineering in panic mode, which is what I don't want to see happen.
Dan, you want to?
Well, thank you guys for that. That's very illuminating, and I find myself in a position that I'm often in and that I quite like, which is an English major with some scientists to answer questions that I have as a general citizen. And that's just a kind of preface here, the way I conceptualize the rest of this panel going, but it's also the rest of my life. This word geoengineering is just one example of the power of words over our minds and our conceptual landscape. And so the word itself is frightening people because of the implications that it has of engineering, which is often seen as clumsy and leading to unintended consequences that are worse than the original fix. And then B, the word geo implying that we're going to do it to the whole planet, which implies that if there were bad unintended side effects, that they might be completely disastrous. So the implications of this word are that it's global, that it's totalizing, that it's technological, which some people like and some people don't, but that it's therefore apolitical, which some people like and some people don't. And that also an implication that if it worked, everything else would stay the same, so that it functions as a way of saying a magic bullet, which some people like and some people don't. So the word itself, and I'm not suggesting that we replace it with the word terraforming, because that's too much of a joke, because we're already on Terra. And even though we have been terraforming since we've been human beings, nevertheless, the kind of power that we bring to bear now, and the fact that we accidentally terraforming ourselves into a dangerous moment, means that you can't really say, well, we need to terraform Earth. Although I say that all the time, and have been for about 10 years, but it's always kind of a joke that needs to be led into an explanation. So I have been trying to use different words to naturalize and recontextualize the discussion so that we don't get flashpoints from both sides. People who are thinking, oh good, magic bullet, I can keep on doing what I'm doing and make money the way I'm making money, and the scientists will solve it for us. Or people from the other side saying, oh my God, another magic bullet that's going to shoot us in the head by accident. And phrases like landscape restoration, because landscape restoration is a friendly phrase. Landscape being less global, and restoration suggesting that there were ways in which it was functioning better and needed to be restored. And also as a field in ecology and in engineering, in ecological engineering. And also assisted migration. This is a new science phrase that has just come out of the literature of the ecologists who have moved a kind of a tree in the panhandle of Florida. They've started planting it up in North Carolina. And the whole thing has begun to be discussed as a kind of a mitigation and adaptation strategy. Ought we, maybe, could we save some species in danger of extinction by doing assisted migration? It's a scary thought in its own way, but on the other hand, it has this kind of lower intensity vibe to it, because we're just assisting things, and migration is something that happens all the time, etc. And also, I often suggest that decarbonizing is a geoengineering. And so when people talk about a magic bullet, if only we had something that we could do that would geoengineer us out of this mess. And, well, yes, it's called decarbonizing fast. So that you return to the main source of the problem, which is the carbon dioxide emissions. And so, and then at some point we're going to need to get into the sort of political/philosophical discussion here of how many people are scared of this deliberate intervention into global systems, doing it on purpose, even though we're already doing it by accident. So that if you say, well, we're terraforming, we're geoengineering, but it's by accident and it's having a negative effect, and people seem to accept that because we haven't tried to do anything. But if we were to try to do something, it would automatically go wrong. And here we get into this kind of anti-science, anti-technology, essentially the vision from Frankenstein of the mad scientist having done something wrong and then the people having to chase the monster off with pitchforks and torches. There is this image in our culture that knowledge can be dangerous and that if we try to do things, this will immediately collapse into making the atom bomb and blowing ourselves up. That leads to an anti-science bias that is also very convenient for business as usual, for power as usual, and will inevitably lead to the kind of disaster scenarios that Tom has outlined. So there are a lot of issues here that I've brought up that are that transcend the technical issues, because as Greg has pointed out a couple of times, and he has a nifty decarbonization scheme in terms of sinking carbon to the bottom of the sea that is also affordable and practical and really good now, as well as the aerosols thing. And so, in a way, once again, the technical problem is not as hard as the political one.
So here's a couple more words. One is sustainability. That's one which, as ecologists, we're trying to promote a lot because sustainability, implies we as humans and our human civilization will stick around, and planetary stewardship. That's a requirement as humans. But I agree. I think the biggest problems are, in a sense, are not the engineering. Those are technical things that can be solved. But if you look at what we know and what we don't know in terms of how we're going to deal with these problems, the biggest, one of the biggest limitations of our knowledge right now is how humans interact with natural systems and understanding the complexities of human systems and how that feeds back into all of this, which is part of the political, the social, the psychological. And we really don't. This is really one of the frontiers of where a lot of the science is right now. The other one, though, the other caution I would put out is we've just seen lots of very good data about what's likely to happen at a global level. And those global climate models have actually gotten pretty good right now. But if you try to downscale those and ask, so what's going to happen at a particular region, at a regional level, in fact, we have almost no good models to try to predict what's going to happen at, let's say Pakistan. So is Pakistan now going to be flooded every 5 years or not? And we're just now trying to get that research done. So the problem, you talk about putting these aerosols up in the Arctic, and I'm thinking, do we really know what's going to happen at a regional scale if we do that?
No, we don't. That's, of course, I'm a physicist. When you don't know about a system, the fastest way to learn about it is to do experiments on it. Try to imagine understanding superconductivity if you could never have done an experiment. It took us half a second. We became convinced that it was the largest and most difficult problem humanity had ever faced. Since maybe the Neanderthals, but they weren't doing all much trouble anyway. And I still think that's true. And the real reason, as Tom pointed out, is that this is a problem with a big inertia that has been gathering for 2 centuries. And the atmosphere, the planet, the biosphere does not give a damn about our politics or about our ethics. It just cares about the heat balance equation. So I tend to focus on the heat balance equation.
So I just want to say something about a sort of moral dilemma that has been raised, and that is, and Stan mentioned this, and that is that, you know, what happens if politicians see this as a silver bullet and say, well, we don't have to bother about reducing emissions of carbon dioxide, changing the coal-fired power stations to renewable energy, you know, we can just engineer the planet, you know, by putting reflectors up in the stratosphere and or higher above the Earth's atmosphere, reflecting the sunlight away, cooling the planet, compensating for the warming due to greenhouse gases. There's two answers to this issue. You know, one is that carbon dioxide is not only bad because it's warming the planet, but it's also changing the chemistry of the ocean. And more carbon dioxide means that the oceans become more acidic. Well, they're not acidic now, but they go towards a more neutral state. But the real problem there is that there are a lot of little beasts at the bottom of the food chain who live because they can produce carbonate shells. And as you change the pH of the ocean, they become less able to do that. And if you destroy the bottom of the food chain, which might happen on a timescale of decades to a century, if we continue doing what we're doing, then that's pretty devastating for the whole ocean biosphere. So, you know, we have to, it's not just a climate problem, but it's a carbon dioxide problem as well. Now, it's possible that we can do one type of geoengineering to solve the climate problem and another type of geoengineering to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. But, you know, that's really compounding uncertainty upon uncertainty, certainly in our present state of knowledge. The other issue, and this is where I have some faith in the fact that scientists ought to be influencing politicians and policy, is that, you know, the scientists they can advise policymakers in these areas, and, you know, in my optimistic way, I hope that eventually politicians will actually listen to the scientists. They don't seem to be doing so at the present time, but I think they've got a lot of issues on their plates, and it's a difficult and sort of transition time at the present moment. And, you know, maybe they're doing nothing, and we'll really will be in trouble if nothing is done by the major economies of the world, and by Australia too, in the sort of perhaps in the leadership role. So, I'm not so worried about politicians coming up and saying, oh, let's just do geoengineering and solve all the problems. There are many arguments against that possibility.
So, Stan, as the humanist, how would you solve the political problem?
Thank you for that. Because I've been thinking about this a lot, and it really is what leads you next. The politicians listen to money because money is fungibly defined as equivalent to free speech. So you cannot deny money from politics because, at least in the United States, money and free speech are equivalencies. Money is simply people's ability to buy lobbyists that will then go talk to the congressman, and it is almost impossible to cut that off. So there are two forces talking to our politicians, more than two, but two big forces in this argument. There's the scientific community, and there's the fossil fuels industry. And the fossil fuels industry has simply studied the methodologies of the tobacco industry into how can you confuse public opinion on a scientific issue. Naomi Oreskes said this very interesting sentence. Here, the fossil fuels industry has been more scientific than the scientists in this sense. They have done research. They have done experiments, like Larry was talking about. They've gone to American cities, and they've paid for certain kinds of disinformation campaigns in newspapers. They've taken polls before and after. They've found which kinds of statements in which kinds of media work to most change public opinion. So, you got your scientific community, you know, naive and innocent like Beaker in the Muppets, and they wave their hand and they say, we got this data, you know, these graphs. And they thought, well, truth will out, or not even truth, but just data, okay, information. And they thought, well, the rest of civilization, being rational and being interested in survival, will now respond to this. And really the difference over the last 10 years, between 10 years ago and now, is that now the scientific community has to realize realization that it's not going to work just to put up the graphs and say to the public, hey, we need the votes, we need the politicians to do things. It's more going to be a battle for hearts and minds that has to do with public opinion and swaying public opinion, what works and what doesn't. And one thing that's kind of scary is money works as part of this. To pay for disinformation to be put out there is simply a technique that does work. And usually the fossil fuels industry has magnitudes more money than scientific associations, which mostly make their money out of the dues of their membership, whereas the fossil fuels industry is making money out of the fossil fuels that they're selling to people for billions of dollars. So here's a problem for you. And what I would love to see is, and I think we're going to see it, is the scientific associations of the world banding together in statements large and small that are going out there and saying, sorry folks, but economics is actually not a science, it's a pseudoscience, it's a support system for power, and in this case, power is dangerous and wrong. And there's going to have to be a gamble made that democratic government world is going to work well enough to overwhelm that particular PowerPoint of money, which is the fossil fuels industry. So that what if the National Academy of Sciences, the AAAS, the NSF, and the 150 scientific associations that have signed off on this problem as being real, what if they all said, we have a better economics here that doesn't do systemic predatory dumping, that doesn't do systemic false pricing. And if there was, in other words, a scientific reinvention of economics as an evaluation of science, that would be one political move. And then it's going to just take constant education. In a democracy, you have to hope that every scientist needs to spend 20% of their time doing PR, more or less pro bono, for the sake of their children, to overwhelm the paid money industry. What do you think?
Well, okay, so the touchstone I always use on this is there's a biennial assessment of scientific knowledge that the National Science Foundation does. And pretty consistently, they find that 20% of the American adults think that the sun goes around the earth. And so, I mean, forget more complex questions. When you're dealing with sort of that baseline level of ignorance, I'm not sure what you do. I think, and then there's another paradox in all of this, which is the message is one of fear, right? We're going to screw up the planet. We need to do something. But what's the main reaction to fear? The main reaction, fear reaction, is not to do anything, right? Because change may make things worse. So what kind of a message do you put out that is going to encourage people to change?
That's a sobering point, and I agree with Stan that it would be great if all the scientists got together and shouted about it, but frankly, we're kind of getting used to not being heard. I don't have a general good way to do it. Maybe I'll write a science fiction novel. No, wait. You already done that. Keep trying. Yeah. I tend to, actually, I am deliberately in the background of the novels I'm intending to write in the next few years, include a past history in which we solved this problem, with a little hint about how we did it. Just to say, let's make this part of the conventional future. That is a future you can believe in and would like to live in, and not a disaster. And it includes, as the precondition, that we have actually become what actually appears in Genesis, stewards of the earth. They're called stewards of the garden. But the first commandment or instruction given by God to Adam and Eve, by the way, was to name the beasts, which is your department.
So I'm not quite so pessimistic about science eventually influencing policy, although I am pessimistic about it being done in time. But a good example, and there's a wonderful book that's just come out by Naomi Oreskes, whose name was just mentioned, where she goes through issues where disinformation campaigns have been very successful, starting with the tobacco industry. Now, eventually the word got through that tobaccos kill people. And so, eventually I think the word will get through, even to people who think the sun revolves around the earth, that global warming is something we have to do something about. The issue is, when is eventually?
It seems right to me that eventually it's a process of continuous reiteration and also continuous education. And there was a tendency, a lot of scientists would prefer to think of themselves as apolitical and also would prefer to focus on their work. It's part of their character to be rather focused and think that their work is the most important thing in their lives, and that other people can focus on other parts of the human enterprise. So, like NASA's requirement of its own research scientists to spend 20% of their time doing broader outreach, NSF asking that all grant applicants have a broader outreach component to their grant proposals so that the money's going to the people who are including PR and outreach. These are structural solutions to the problem to get them out there to continue the education project so that eventually, as Tom says, we get there. And I think it's possible also to continually pound away on it. And Greg and I ran a global warming panel at the WorldCon in 2006 in Anaheim, and it's true what Sam said. I mean, a good portion of our very large audience were composed of science fiction fans who knew better because they were so smart and they were skeptics. And this was just a stance that we had to argue with a little bit. And
I shout down was more effective.
It kind of helps to have a left-right punch of a scientist and a humanist coming at them at once from both sides. And I think it shocked them a little that both of us were so damn sure that there was a problem involved. And so the education process continues in that way, because everybody's a skeptic.
Well, what I worry about, though, is what I'm seeing, for example, right now in the American political cycle, where you get into this feedback effect of the more people become skeptical, right? The less they're willing to listen to leaders, the more the tipping point moves in the other direction. So, in fact, climate skepticism is increasing in the United States right now, and what will happen is, as the climate gets worse and economic conditions get worse, that will feed back on this and just increase that skepticism. So we're going to get ourselves into a cycle that we can't get out of. And so how will you get us out of that cycle?
Why do you think the feedback's negative? Because I remember there around Katrina and then Rita, which nobody remembers, but where I grew up in Southern Alabama, just a few weeks later, it was strongly associated with global warming, largely improperly, I think, but it's certainly true that if you're warming the oceans, you're going to get more hurricanes. So, but I think, unfortunately, that we're going to get, on a scale of 10 to 20 years, some big-scale disasters that you can't discount, and that might convince people, at least I hope so, do you not?
Well, okay, so the reason I'm skeptical is there's some interesting sort of neurobiology work that shows that when humans are under stress, they become more paranoid and fearful and less likely to believe other people. And, there's probably a good evolutionary reason, right? When you're a monkey and things are bad, what should you do? You should try to avoid as many new things as possible. And so that's why I think that we could get into this, if the economy keeps getting worse and worse because of what we're doing to the climate.
I think, though, that the history of the last couple hundred years shows also that culture has been more and more influenced by science and by scientists. And this is a good thing and a sign of hope. Because when the trouble comes down, the people will be scared, and there is a fight or flight or a freeze reaction. But there is also government. And so if 51% of the people are voting for leaders that are looking out for the best interest of the entire culture, then at that point the leaders are going to go eventually to the science community to ask for policy advice, and at that point we would be in much better shape. And I also want to remind everybody that cultural change can be really, really fast. That the difference difference in the attitudes towards everything between, say, 1928 and 1932 were extremely different. Same between 1978 and 1982. Same between, September 1st, 2001 and September 12th, 2001. So there can be rapid cultural change. And it could be that a time will come where it's just a given. Oh, yeah, gas costs 3 cents a gallon extra because we're gathering the carbon tax to save the world. It's a good thing. It's just like sending your kids to kindergarten. You do it because it's the law. And I think that what we need to do is just push for that culture change and also identify the sources of resistance in the fossil fuels industry, in the U.S. Republican Party leadership, in its most cynical wing, etc. And then really attack them as being bad for our kids.
Okay, so let's open this up to a few questions. There's been a hand up over here.
I can tell you confidentially, no, not confidentially, Bill Gates has realized that for a $1 or so billion a year, he could try to save the Arctic. And he's already spent over $5 billion on tobacco research, on general measures. But I think actually that's a very good idea. I don't pretend to be a political scientist, right? I don't know where the pressure points are or how to get them. But indeed, there may be some really effective ones. And the insurance companies really are looking at this. I do know that, or at least I've heard that they are. Particularly after Rita and Katrina.
Yeah, it's just a technical point, but the reinsurance industry, really monstrously big companies that insure the insurance companies, they have natural catastrophe units, and they definitely are looking into this. So there are pressure points, and I think it's valid to bring up exactly what you said, that, democracy is good and important and right, but also there's vanguard movements, there's pressure points, there's moments where we can try to, if democracy is being manipulated to the point where it's not functioning well for the welfare of mankind, then education is crucial, but then also, pushback is not at all out of line with the danger of the situation.
Other questions? Yes.
There's been a lot of concern about democracy, saying that democracy is not allowed to get global influence. Most democratic countries in the world went to Copenhagen in favor of it. Okay. If it had just been democratic countries that went to Copenhagen, we had to agree right now on issues. The reason we did it was because China got involved, not democratic. So, I
think you're forgetting India was also, So the comment was, to what extent it's a function of democratic governments versus others. Who were the people who were holding back at Copenhagen? And certainly the important one was China, but I would counter by saying India and the United States were the other two big players who were holding back. And so, so it's a good question about whether the form of government matters.
Yeah, that's true. Nobody there, although there was some agitation about it. But let me point out that 28 nations signed the Kyoto Accords, as I recall, and how many complied? 5. And most of them, because they're kind of like Russia, the economy collapse. The real problem is getting it through things like Congress. Remember, the Senate defeated Kyoto ratification 98-0.
I think that China is both a huge problem and also a source of potential hope, because their country is so rapidly getting wrecked ecologically that that's 1/7 of the world's population on a rather small landmass, especially workable landmass, somewhat like Australia in that sense that not much of the country is hydrated. And also there's only 200 people that need to change their minds on this issue there and for the good of their own country, and they're being advised by their own scientists who are in communication with the rest of the scientific world. So that you could imagine China footing culturally faster and more decisively than the United States with its mucky democratic countervailing pressures and money.
There's one interesting thing about China, and that is, right now, and I think this is fairly common knowledge, but they're building a new coal-fired power station about every 5 days. But they're also building 50 nuclear power stations. And, as a cynic, you can look at the writing here between the lines, and that is, I think they realise that this is a serious problem. And so they're building their own insurance policy. They're moving away from dependence on coal. And I think the implications for Australia of that are really fairly large. So, I think we've got to watch what these other countries are doing and try and interpret what they're doing in the best possible way.
Other questions? Down front?
Just on the geoengineering, some potential downsides to the Arctic. Maybe from you, Sam, as the Earth Science Systems person, or
You mean, what are the problems of trying to do that sort of engineering?
what are the potential worst-case scenarios of the experiment?
To specify, if the aerosols fall to the surface of the snow and darken the snow, therefore melting the snow faster, can you address that?
No, they don't. Actually, I checked with some experts on this. It doesn't darken the snow. Well, for one thing, most of it's going to come down in snow. It'll be very, but in any case, it's less than 1% of the sulfur that's already in the Arctic air. So it's a small effect. The major concerns about aerosol engineering, let's just say the Arctic, are changes in the precipitation pattern elsewhere. And some simulations have shown changes in the range of like 3%, say, in the Indian monsoon, but actually reducing the monsoon would be a good idea because the principal cause of damage in the monsoon is flooding.
Yeah, and so I would say, as I mentioned before, though, we really don't know what's going to happen at a regional scale just because we just don't have those models. Back there? Yes.
I've spent 30 years of my life doing this sort of work, and in fact, you're not wrong. The point is that we can, in some cases, we've actually got old thermometers. In fact, we even have the original thermometers that Galileo used, and this very little scientific paper that someone wrote about 30 years ago, where they recalibrated those thermometers and then were able to interpret old temperature measurements that he'd made in the context of present-day technology. And we can do that with things like the way we measure sea surface temperatures and so on. It's a real problem, but it's a problem that has been investigated over and over again and basically solved. So I don't think there's that degree of uncertainty that you were implying in those early temperature records.
So, other questions? Way back there. Okay, last question.
I don't know where you gentlemen sit in terms of the engineering community, but are you talking to the institutions of the engineering community? Are
I spoke once to the National Science Foundation's engineering group in Phoenix, Arizona. Their annual convention of about 1,000 people in the audience. I was the banquet entertainment. Afterwards, the main comment was, "Sir, it is amazing that you could give an hour talk without PowerPoint." So I think everybody is in communication, but whether, it's an ongoing process, I think.
Very factual slogan this year is sustainability.
Yes.
Sustainable engineering,
Yeah.
sustainability for the future, and population control. They're asking everyone that will tell them how to get this kind of message out to all of the boards throughout every government in the world. How to do it.
Okay.
The type of gentlemen that take that message.
Okay, well, and we are trying. So we've got about 1 more minute. If anybody has any final comments?
I might mention that, one thing that nobody thinks is of geoengineering, but which really would be effective, is to try to stop the rise in population. Human population. Particularly in the tropics, where most of the population growth is occurring, and the tropics will suffer the most from climate change. They already are.
Now, I said this in 2006 when Greg made the same point, an important one. The fastest way to slow population growth is an increase in women's rights. So,
Well, so my favorite way to sequester carbon is to buy books.